In the previous chapters, we've been looking at a lot of the features of the language of PHP. Before we go further, I want to stop and take a look at some troubleshooting techniques that can help you out if you get in a jam. And we've already seen a couple of those, but they're worth reviewing all together. The first thing we'll want to make sure of is that we've set our PHP to correctly display errors and with the correct error reporting. We did that back when we did the configuration of PHP in the installation chapter. The reason I call that one of the pitfalls is because we want to make sure when we're developing that we are able to see those errors on our screen, but then once we actually deploy it, we want to make sure that we don't see those errors anymore. That's going to be very important because we don't want our end users to get that same kind of feedback that as developers we want. So we want to be careful about that and be mindful that when it's on our local machine, we want to display the errors, and when it's in production, we don't. But obviously, once our file is in production, we don't want to stop knowing about those errors. We need to know what kind of errors our users are coming across. In fact, it's probably more important then than it is even in development because people are having problems with our website. So what do we do once we've turned off display errors? You'll want to take a look at the log files. Apache, by default, is going to log any errors that it comes across, and that's going to be stored in a variety of places. You can look for it in the httpd conf file to find out where it's logging. By default, on the Mac, it's probably going to be stored in private var log httpd/errorlog. On Windows, if you're installed using WAMP, it's going to store those into c:/WAMP \log / and then whatever the error log is. There's a separate one for Apache, for PHP, for MySQL. You can also get to them from the WAMP menu that's down in the lower right corner. Now, once you put it in production, it may be in a completely different place because Apache on your production server may be set up differently. And if you're using a shared host, they may have put those error logs in a shared space or somewhere where maybe you have access to it through a web browser or something like that instead. So you'll want to find out where those error logs are once you put it into production. In the meantime, we won't really need to look at these that much during development because we're going to have display errors turned on so that we can see it. Now, when we have display errors and error reporting turned on, we get pretty good feedback from PHP. We're able to catch a lot of the other pitfalls that are going to come up. For example, typos, semicolons, and closing braces. These are going to come up a lot, especially when you're a beginner. You're going to make sure that everything is typed and spelled correctly. You're going to make sure you have semicolons at the end of every line, and that every time you open a brace, and when I say braces, I'm talking not just about curly braces, but opening square brackets, opening parentheses. You want to make sure that they always match. And if you're writing complex if-then statements that have lots of and, ors, and nots, you're really going to have to be careful to make sure that every time you open a parentheses, you close it as well. And PHP is going to give us some feedback about that and help us out while we have display errors turned on. And we've seen that already. For example, here I am in the functions file that we were just working with. If I take away a semicolon and I save the page and go back and reload it in the browser, PHP comes back and tells me that it had a syntax error. Syntax error largely will equate to you had some kind of a typo. I tried to process the language and couldn't understand what you were trying to tell me. Because it was a missing semicolon, what comes after it may be a little bit unpredictable. So the fact that it was an unexpected T function says basically it was unexpected that it got a function next because it was expecting something else here. So it's not actually a function problem. It's a problem with the syntax, and we want to check for parentheses and semicolons. Notice also that it told me that the error was on line 20. Now, in most text editors, you can turn on the ability to see line numbers. In TextMate, I can do that by using View and selecting Gutter and then Line Numbers. And you'll see it even has a quick key out here. And that'll put line numbers out in the gutter for me so I can quickly find, here's line 20, and here's the problem on the line right before that. And I can type my semicolon, save it, and reload the page and not get the error. So turning on line numbers can be very helpful for you, and I encourage you to use a text editor that will allow you to do that. The third pitfall that everyone makes, but especially beginners, is getting used to the difference between equals versus the double equals when it's a comparison operator. So equals is an assignment operator when we're assigning a value to a variable. Double equals is when we're comparing two things in one of our Boolean test cases. You can remember in one of the earlier chapters I said that I often think of it as being two scales side by side, weighing whether something is equal or not. Now, there are going to be more PHP pitfalls along the way, and I'll come back to this and tell you what the rest of them are as we get to them, but these are the first three that we've encountered already. In addition to letting PHP tell us about the errors that it finds in the syntax, for example, or undefined functions, double-defined functions, and those kinds of things that we've already run into while we were learning the language. There are a few other tools that are at our disposal. We can, for example, echo a variable back. Now, it's very simple, but it's useful. If we want to test whether or not something equals what we think it ought to, just output it to the browser where we can see it. Maybe we've got a variable that's going through a loop, and we want to just echo it every time it goes through the loop so that we actually can look in our browser and see what the value is as it's going through each time to check and make sure that our loop is working correctly. We also saw the print_r function, or print readable, which works on an array and gives us nice readable array information, not just about the keys and values in the array, but about the array structure itself. And we saw the getType function, where we can get the type of a variable and find out, is it a string, is it an array, and make sure that we're working with the type in the correct way. There's also the var_dump function, which is going to give us both the type and the value about the variable. This might be really valuable to you, and I encourage you to try it and see what kind of information it gives you. See which ones of these techniques you prefer to find out about the variable type and value. If we can use variable dump to do what getType and echo do at the same time, it might be a lot more efficient. And last of all is get_defined_vars. It's a function with no arguments, and it will return an array of all of the defined variables. Now, of course, it's an array, so we're going to need to print_r that array if we want to see it in a nice readable format. But getDefinedVars is going to give us all of the variables that have been defined. Now, that's going to include the variables that we defined as users, but it's also going to include all of the PHP-defined variables as well. And so you'll see some things there that you didn't create. If you don't know what they are, you can safely ignore them and just look at the ones that apply to you. But that's also going to be useful to see sort of everything that PHP is holding in its hands at that very moment. So we have some tools that are available to us so that we can make sure that we always have the values we expect throughout our PHP programming, and to be able to check and see what went wrong and why things may not have turned out exactly the way we expected. So let's keep those in mind and use them as we go forward to developing.